Please take your seats. My name is Ramesh Singh. I'm an outgoing president of the Natural Hazards Group. And this is a session where a Gilbert awardee is going to give a talk. And Gilbert awardee for this year is Dr. Lucy Jones. Dr. Lucy Jones obtained Bachelor of Arts in Chinese language and literature from Brown University, and she obtained a PhD from MIT. Presently, she is the founder and chief scientist of Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, and also research associate at the Seismological Laboratory of California Institute of Technology. Dr. Lucy Jones has been active in earthquake research for decades, furthering earthquake risk reduction, including 33 years of federal service with USGS. Her work at USGS included developing the methodology for estimating the probability that an earthquake will be foreshock to a bigger event. In California, we are expecting a bigger event. And she has created, led the creation of a national science strategy for natural hazards research, creating the first American major earthquake drill, the Great Shakeout, that has expanded now to encompass 55 million participants around the world. She has written more than 100 papers and books on statistical seismology and integrated disaster scenarios. She has received several awards, to include some: Samuel Heyman Service to America Medal, Ambassador Award from AGU, a Distinguished Service Award from the US Department of Interior, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Western States Seismic Policy Council, and the 2000 Alfred Elquist Special Recognition Medal and the 2017 Distinguished Lecture Award, both from the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. She received 2018 Gilbert Award. She is known as Earthquake Lady, at least in California. Whenever earthquake occurred in California or around the world, small kids, including senior scientists, watch her on TV, and everyone excited to listen her expert's opinion. Our university offered her as a Dean of Science and Technology College, but she decided to help the community at large and founded Center with a mission to foster the understanding and application of scientific information in the creation of more resilient communities. Natural Hazard Section awarded her Gilbert Award for the year 2018. Let us welcome Lucy Jones.
Thank you, Ramesh, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to talk today not just about science, but about how we get our science used. How do we move on to activating our science in the community at large? And I want to start with a recent occurrence, just remind you what was going on this summer. USGS put out daily reports for a while like this. Oh, are we not going to hear it?
Observatory. A quick update on what's happening today at Kilauea. In the lower East Rift Zone, we've had an additional outbreak at the northeast end of the fissure system, about half a mile south of Highway 132. This is producing spatter that's flying tens of meters into the air and a sluggish lava flow that's moving a little bit to the north, but no big lava flow has yet developed. All of this is to say that the situation down there remains dynamic, and as we've been saying for days now, the
All right, we don't need to go into details. We all watched it probably ourselves this summer. But I just want to say, is there anyone in this room who's not just a little bit jealous of what they got to do at Kilauea this summer? Wonderful science, incredible data. People needed you and they listened to you. I mean, I really want to call out too that I think they did a particularly good job of getting out there and explaining the information directly. But this is what I would call science. I tried to call it science in action. The problem is whenever you say it instead of just read it, it becomes inactive science rather than active science. So let's talk about how do we get science activated? How do we move on? And I'm using this term rather than talking about communication because I think there's some important differences that are going on. When we look at science communication, it is inherently a unidirectional process. We have information that we want to go and explain to others, but it tends to be, I have something to give you. What I want to say is that when we move to science activation, we really need to be looking at bilateral communication. And it's exchanging information, because I have information as a scientist about the consequences, but the policymaker has information about all of the other constraints on what they can be doing. And to get to a solution that actually works, we need to empower those policymakers to use our information, not just make sure that they receive it. Right? But it's something that we are really challenged to do. I mean, we end up like this, having protests about why people aren't listening to our science. How did we get here instead of being a place where we are partnering with the policymakers and doing it? And so a lot of what I want to do today is go through the issues that we as scientists face that have gotten in the way. I want to make a point. I am not saying this is all our fault. I'm saying that as scientists, there are parts of what we do that we can shift to make this happen more easily, because while some people may never listen to what we have to say, there are a lot of people out there who would really like to use our information for a better society. So what are the challenges to science activation? I want to start with real cultural differences between scientists and the rest of the world about how we communicate. I realize this is not the biggest screen, and some of you sitting in the back may not quite be able to see this, but this XKCD comic, I think, was one of the best things I ever saw, right? You do something, you get zapped, the normal person says, I think I better not do this again. The scientist goes, I wonder if this will happen the second time, right? As a scientist, we come in there and say, we know that just having something happen once doesn't tell you what's true, right? The plural of anecdote is not data, right? We need to know that we need to go in and test and retest. And you might actually say, why doesn't everybody, why is this solely a feature of scientists? Well, in fact, human beings evolved our reason not to discover truth, but really rather to win arguments. If you look back at the history of the human race, we developed our reasoning ability in very important ways to help us manage a difficult world where we weren't the biggest animal around, but we did it in the context of small groups of people or in a hyper-socialized setting. You needed to be sure that you weren't always the one going out to hunt the mammoth while other people sat home in safety in the cave, right? You needed to win the argument that convinced the others to go out with you. And the social scientists tell us that this has affected the way in which we process data, and that we have what's called a confirmation bias, which is, we are more accepting of data that confirms our position and less accepting of data that contradicts it. We have an internal yes man that makes us feel better about what we're doing. And so this is normal human behavior, but it makes it difficult to understand if something's really true. And we evolved the scientific method as a way of getting around this, as a way of getting beyond our own internal confirmation bias and figuring out what's true. And so let's think about what it actually means to have a scientific method, right? We notice something, we see a coincidence in the natural world, and we need to make a test to see if it's coincidental. Does it show up again? Is this anecdote or is it data? Okay. So then we create a model that's consistent with other known information that explains the phenomenon we've just experienced or witnessed, and we make predictions from that model and test the predictions using statistics. And then we publish this and give it to our colleagues to help them see whether or not we have fallen victim to the confirmation bias. And they take our results and they usually rip us to shreds, right? This is a big part of the scientific process. And when you're a graduate student going and learning how to create scientific information to write your first paper, you discover that if you ever give your result before you've laid out your methods and background, you're going to get ripped to shreds. So you learn to never communicate that way. And as scientists, whenever we talk about it, we lay out the background, we describe our methods, we evaluate and go and say what our uncertainties are, and we do all of that before we ever give results. And I think as scientists, it is so implicit in our environment, we go, well, yeah, how else would you do this? Of course, the reality is the rest of the world doesn't do it this way. Read any newspaper article. The result is given first, then they explain why it matters, and if you ever make it to the end of the article, then you get the background and the material that helps you evaluate whether or not it's true. Right? So we have this situation where we are communicating in a fundamentally different way than the rest of the world. And when we take that method and take it out to the public sphere, it often leads to miscommunication. There are two big issues. One is we know we need to avoid stories. Stories get you the wrong answers. Anecdotes are misleading. But the rest of the world makes their decisions with stories. And so we have a challenge that we've got to figure out how to embrace stories that aren't misleading. How do we stay true to our scientific integrity while letting the stories be in there? The other big thing that's a major issue is we discuss our uncertainties before we give our results. And when we lay out all of those uncertainties, we often have a situation where the person who is listening to us hears that we are uncertain and hears that and tunes out whatever the result is. So there's partly that we do this, it's also how we go about discussing uncertainties. So there's the next thing I really want to look at, is cultural differences within the scientific community and the science endeavor to the rest of the world about how uncertainties and probabilities are addressed. And a fundamental issue, let's go back to that evolutionary process again. When we perceive risk, we are more frightened of the part of it we don't understand. There's a great book, if you want to understand risk perception in general, by Paul Slovic out of the University of Oregon. But the fundamental is anything that triggers our fear of the hidden predator is going to make us more frightened. So if we can't see the risk, if we don't know, we can't quantify the risk, if we believe it is unknowable, all of those things increase the fear. It's why earthquakes are more frightening than floods, even though floods do just as much damage. Who's afraid of the rain? You can see the water coming, whereas earthquakes come in unpredicted and unseeable. And very few people would evaluate their risk as being the same between those two different realms, right? So we have it as a specific issue, but we've taken it overall. This concept that if something is random, it is much more frightening. And when you think about that, actually think about how we use patterns in the human world, right? Again, evolutionarily, if you could look at that moving grass and hypothesize a hidden predator, you were more likely to live to have progeny. So we were rewarded for being able to make patterns, especially when faced with danger. That is our big instinctive response. We do it all the time. It has been incredibly important for human survival. When you can hypothesize the connection between the mushrooms you just ate and the gastrointestinal distress that you're now suffering, making that pattern was really important for our survival. The problem is we make the patterns even when they don't exist, right? We know how to make patterns in a lot of different places, right? And we do it in terms of lots of everything where we're facing a risk. Think about hearing that somebody you know has cancer. What's the first thing you think of? Did he smoke? Or perhaps he's a geochemist. What was he smelling in that lab, right? We try to find a pattern that says why he had it. We hear somebody has had a heart attack. Well, you know, look at that weight problem they're suffering with. I've been out and I've been exercising. It's not going to happen to me. We try to find a pattern that lets us be safe in the face of all of this. Right? When you get to let's take it a moment now and come back to the natural hazards focus group and think about how this applies to natural hazards. Have you ever thought about the origin of the word disaster? It actually first shows up with Shakespeare, and it means ill-starred, disaster. It reflects our belief that a disaster happens to us because our fate was written in the stars. And this is back to the idea that we can't accept that it's just random. And as you look over human cultures, you will discover that nobody's been willing to accept randomness of natural disasters. You know, go back to pagan culture and the volcano's erupting because Venus just cheated on Vulcan and he's having a male hissy fit over it, right? Go into the Judeo-Christian tradition and they say, no, God is good. God just won't capriciously hit you. God's somebody you can make a covenant with, so if he hits you with a disaster, it must be your fault. Every culture in the world has a flood tradition. It's only in the Judeo-Christian tradition that we make it the victim's fault, because it was a way of reconciling this randomness that must have a reason, therefore it's God because I can't find any other reason, with the fact that you have God good, then you make it your own fault. Of course, this stayed in Western culture until you get the Lisbon Earthquake of 1755, which actually happened on the morning of All Saints' Day at the height of the Catholic Mass, a country that was completely Catholic, very devout at the time. All the people the pious in the pews were crushed, and the prostitutes up in the wooden buildings on the hills were basically spared. So it caused a pretty significant philosophical crisis, trying to understand the difference, leading to a lot of, actually the beginning of a lot of seismology, as maybe this isn't all just God's doing. But among many people, it was considered God's doing. One of the most astonishing things I discovered is that if you look at the Dutch were requested to send aid to Lisbon, and their response was that God has decided how much the people of Lisbon should suffer, and it's not our place to change what God has decreed. It is not just a Western thing, though. I want to make a point, just remind you that if you go into the Asian tradition, disasters happen because you have a yin-yang imbalance. Right? In the West, we focus on personal relationship with God. In the East, there's more of a focus on social harmony. So the earthquakes happen when the yin overpowers the yang because, say, for instance, the emperor is about to die. This stayed very common in all of the Asian cultures. It's a fundamental part of Confucianism. If you actually go up to the 1976 Tangshan earthquake, happened when Mao was extremely ill. He actually died 6 weeks later. It led to, completely destroyed the city of Tangshan, and led to mass evacuation. About 500 million people were living outside over the next month, and a lot of rumors that it meant that Mao was going to die. When he did indeed die 6 weeks later, it was only a few weeks before the Gang of Four was arrested. And if you look at the indictment of the Gang of Four, you will actually find that they discussed usurping Mao's power and other phrases that actually came out of that 2nd century BC book about the causes of earthquakes. They never said they caused the earthquake, but they used the phrases to help get the indictment on through. So it's something that continues to speak at a lot of different levels. This is fundamentally the fear of randomness, and it affects how people hear our data, even now in the modern world. And, I thought I'd find a picture of a seismologist giving a press conference after an earthquake. I found a whole lot of choices. You can go in Japan or in China or in California. When an earthquake happens, the media all run to the seismolab. Why? Why does it help you to deal with the earthquake knowing what the name of the fault is? And the reason is it reduces that feeling of fear generated by randomness and uncertainty. We give it a name, we give it a number, we give it a fault. We're saying that somebody understands it. At the time of these press conferences, we are often tempted to share our uncertainty, right? Because when the earthquake first happens, there's a lot we don't know. And we're still trying to research it. And in fact, the media, faced with a bunch of nerds that they need to try and get talking, they've discovered that one way of getting scientists to talk is to say, what did you learn in the earthquake? Because, right, that gets scientists excited. I want to talk about what I'm learning. So we talk about what we didn't know. And we often do not talk about what we do know about the event. You know, I've actually started, there was one event I went, not much, pretty much all of the damage was completely predicted before it happened. This is what we expect to happen when you leave these buildings. And, you know, which wasn't really what they were hoping to hear. But I think it's something that we have to do more of because, right, when we discuss probabilities and uncertainties, we can increase fear. And the problem is, of course, is that increasing fear is also decreasing their action, right? What we as scientists know that as long as our uncertainties are below some level, this is as close to certain as we get, and a low uncertainty is a good thing and it's something that you act on. But as long as we're talking about those uncertainties, often all that's being heard is that we are uncertain. And you know, the other aspect of this is that when we're really dealing with uncertainties and probabilities, we're also often talking about the part that we're not really certain of. And that really raises the question of what is it that we should be talking about? And I could argue when you go and look at the earthquakes in California, we don't need to be telling them whether the probability of a certain earthquake is 40% or 60%. We need to be telling them that when the earthquake on the San Andreas Fault does move, it is breaking that pipe for absolute certainty. That's not something that much of the population knows, that the earthquake on the fault means the fault's moving, means everything's being broken. So sometimes what it is that they need is not what we're doing our research on. It's doing that part that we don't really, that is already settled, and we don't know what to do. So here is one of the next challenges to science activation, is that the newest science is often not yet settled science. And it becomes the question of when do we take our information to the public? And since we're sitting here at AGU, I would like to think about how we do it here. It is important to AGU's future and support and visibility to be able to get out and say that we're doing exciting things. There I heard 400 media representatives at this meeting. And they are going to be doing stories on the papers being released here. But what does it mean to be a paper at AGU? You've got to be new science. If you've already published it, you're not supposed to be giving it here. The AGU meeting is intended as the place where we take our new ideas, present them to our colleagues, get ripped to shreds, find the weaknesses in our arguments. They are not yet settled science. And when we come out and we give the newest thing at the AGU meeting, and that goes out to the public and they hear this exciting new result, they go, oh, that's really interesting. These must be smart people that are important to have around. But then next year, they hear that we have a different result, and now we say something different. And what goes on as that continues, there becomes a message to the larger public that the scientists don't know what they're talking about. They're always changing their answers. We know that this is the process by which we figure out that it is true, but we're now communicating it solely at this early stage in the process. When it reaches the point that it is actually settled and we should be getting it to the public, we've pretty much stopped caring about it. It's now boring. Who wants to talk about it? Yeah, so the fault moves in the earthquake. Duh. We all know that. Why are we going to be talking about it? So again, there is this challenge that's presented by the fact that we as scientists work in this research space. This is what we get promoted for, and yet that's probably not the point that we should be passing it on. If you look at, earthquake results, can we show that we are doing better than a random distribution? You think about these models that we put out, right? There's one level at which we do it in which we are looking at the spatial distribution, time independent. There's not a lot of debate over that process. There's still some, but I think anybody who thinks that California doesn't have more earthquakes than Virginia, you know, we do know that that's true, and there's a level at which you act on it. But we also are going and putting in temporal models. And do we know that we're doing better with random? You know, as scientists, we know that there's a possibility that we're wrong. That's one of the fundamental things of being a scientist. You accept that no matter what you're doing, you could be proved wrong. Some of us are better than others at accepting it. We are human beings. We've got all those challenges, but that is a fundamental of science. You know, I heard a story of the 1968 AGU in DC, where one of the big magnetic reversal trail, L. Allen 7, was put up on the wall, and a famous opponent of plate tectonics came in and saw this data. Everybody goes quiet to see how he'd react. And he apparently looked at it a long time in silence, turned to the author, which I think was J. Tusa Wilson, said, "Congratulations," walked out of the room, left the meeting, didn't come back. He had a hard time accepting it, but in the end, the data won. That's what we should be acting from. And yet that, again, is not something that's a characteristic of the general population. And we have trouble with actually accepting that we need to use the statistics. You know, there was one point at which I made the argument that we should only be doing public policy if we could actually prove through a statistical analysis that we were doing better than random. Random should be what we operated from until we could prove that we were doing better. And I had a senior geophysicist say to me, "But if we use that standard, we won't have anything to say." So I just looked at him. You know, if we can't show that we're actually better, should we be saying it? Right? And I think we can really trap ourselves. One of the more embarrassing things, I think, that's happened within our community was the Parkfield earthquake experiment. And I would argue that that was a point where our shared confirmation bias kept us from seeing that the statistics really were not valid. When you go in and dig, when you look back at what was done, we basically said there's the earthquake has a 95% chance of happening by this time if our model is 100% correct. And we forgot to add that last phrase, right? And there are consequences for it. I think you can look at the public health realm to see some of the really big consequences when you push out science before it's absolutely certain. And I don't think we're ever going to stop doing the stuff at the edge because it's too exciting to us, and potentially there are some really important things. But we need to do a better job of supporting the science getting out that actually is settled. The downside of this is we aren't ever getting out the part we already know. We're no longer interested in it. I'll finish my last big point that I want to make on this is the other pressure that we have to stay in our lanes. We are only supposed to be talking about our own work. You know, when I worked for the USGS, I could not talk publicly about climate change because I'm not an atmospheric scientist. But again, what really needs to be known is not the details of how the atmospheric models or systems are working, but the fact the temperature really is up and CO2 really is up and they really are correlated and we got to do something about it. It doesn't require the edge of science. And when we do this, we have the potential of providing incomplete information. I think if you look at what's happened with climate change, the scientists have been very concerned about going beyond their expertise. So I say, we know that climate change is happening and we really are doing this. And then we realize we need to go farther than that and add, and these are the implications of not moving on. Here are the bad things that are going to happen. But legitimately, as scientists, we haven't wanted to say, this is what you should do about it, because it's not our job to do policy. It is our job to say, these 5 solutions would give you these consequences. And we struggle to get there. We are much more comfortable just staying in our own expertise. Here's the problem. And the problem with that is the communication specialists give us very, very clearly that when we give a problem without a solution, we are increasing fear. We are showing people there's something really wrong and we don't give them a way out of it. And so somehow we have to figure out how to do shared messages with the people who are empowered to be giving those answers, which is why putting a scientist actively working with policymakers becomes such a powerful place to be. I have an example that I like to use for this, which is just saying, imagine you're standing in a road or standing by a road and you see somebody in the middle of the road with a lot of cars going by. What do you say to them? Hopefully you say, hey, there's a car coming, get out of the road. You shouldn't be yelling out, hey, remember, force equals mass times acceleration. Right? It is the relevant science, but it's not what they need to be hearing at that point. And we need to move beyond our relative science to what the advice, and if that means partnering with somebody else who's empowered to give the advice, that's the way we should do it. So those are sort of my big things of what I see the problems are. I want to show you one way in which I tried to move on from that to doing work that would make a difference. And this, of course, shows the Shakeout Scenario that was done by hundreds of people together, led by the USGS, but with a lot of other partners in California, trying to go beyond saying, we know we're going to have an earthquake, to saying, what will this earthquake really be doing with you? And we created fancy graphics, because fancy graphics get people to look more clearly. That is, by the way, the ground motions in the Coachella Valley, where I really hope I will not be when this earthquake hits. But then on the left, I also show the open file, or the circular that we created. We turned it into a story. We called it a story that Southern Californians are writing. We provided the scientific information, but we did it with a story that began 10 minutes before the earthquake and went to 6 months after. And we integrated across the science. We spent a huge amount of work. I see a couple of people who were involved with this who know just how many arguments we had to go through to get people to be in consensus, and how much we got beaten up about it, because you can always argue the details. And we had to go over and over. We are not saying this is the earthquake's going to happen. We're saying if this earthquake happened, nobody would be surprised. And that's a subtle difference, but it's really important. Because we don't know exactly what will happen, we were not getting out the information of the implications. So we created a plausible scenario, said what the consequences were, and fundamentally, it was a scientifically defensible story. So we got the arguments out of the way in private, and there were more than a few. But when we finally went out, we had gotten the whole community to say, yes, this is reasonable. And we were able to get people to engage on it. So it was a focus on useful science, the fault's going to move, the stuff, not the newest science. And we look at, this isn't the way you get yourself your AGU fellow, but it is the way in which you make a difference for your community. It was, right away, it was used dramatically for emergency management. And then I discovered the interesting part, that whole fear of randomness keeps us focused on the moment at which the disaster happened. And we got plenty of people wanting to use this for planning response. We struggle to get them to use it for prevention. So we show that the fault's going to break through all these gas lines at Cajon Pass. They wanted to use that to plan for their fire response. And I'm like, why don't we retrofit the gas lines and prevent the fire? And yet there's that psychology of the randomness that kept us on that moment. So I actually, through a colleague who had met Mayor Garcetti knew Mayor Garcetti before he was elected. After he was elected in 2013 to be the mayor of Los Angeles, I asked for an interview with him, a meeting with him, and we ended up agreeing in an experiment. I spent a year at the City of Los Angeles as a USGS employee. It was a technical assistance agreement between the federal agency and the city. As far as we know, it's the first time that's happened with the Federal Science Agency, to support them as they made these decisions. And the process turned out to be extraordinarily successful. Out of it came 18 recommendations. We had 4 of them about the buildings. Over 15,000 buildings that are known to be dangerous are being retrofitted under a mandatory program. We already have 6,000 soft-first-story buildings that have been completed in the 3 years since this got enacted. We're going after concrete buildings. It was the first time anyone took that on. $1 billion it's going to cost the building owners, and we got the building owners and management associations standing with the mayor and supporting it when we released this. There are also issues around the water. One of the great things about Southern California, we bring in all our water. Well, we bring in all our water across the San Andreas Fault. 4 major aqueducts cross the fault in the area that's going to break in that earthquake. We are probably going to lose them all at the same moment. We also have a major problem with pipes in the ground that break in earthquakes. And there are seismic resistant pipes. This is a pipe from Japan. The mayor committed to the future of our water system would be a future of seismic resistant pipes, committed that they would buy those pipes, went to American companies and said, can't you supply this? They said, oh, no, too expensive. You got to use our regular ones. The city stuck to their guns, and there are now 8 different companies that are now providing seismic resistant pipes. Over these last 4 years since we did this, they've stepped up. They've all been tested. Cornell is providing testing of these different pipes. The prices are coming down. They are now getting adopted by other cities. So again, it's a major program to work with the state about dealing with the aqueducts as they cross the San Andreas, developing the seismic distribution pipes, and firefighting capability as well. The last area was actually about some of this is a picture of Cajon Pass, for those of you who can see that the San Andreas is running sort of west-northwest across the field, right where the highway changes direction. You go in and you look in detail, and it's we have all the major lifelines, pipes, fiber optics, freeway, railway, and electrical distribution lines all crossing the San Andreas within 400 meters of each other. We have now gotten an agreement that's coming in at the state level to go in and try to address these issues and try to start, we're having, it's a very long process, but the workshops are happening and the people are starting to talk together about how we promote this. And a bunch of other things that happened as well. I'm not trying to spend all this time on this. 5 of the programs required city councils ordinances. Everyone passed unanimously. As I said, before we got out there, we had the business community with us in supporting this. I got to leave then after we said it was going to be done and left it. They hired a chief resilience officer to actually implement it, a wonderful woman. I sort of feel bad sometimes about what I left her with, but it is moving forward. And then when I got back, to Pasadena, we then got approached by the Southern California Association of Governments. Los Angeles is one of 192 cities in these 6 counties of Southern California. It's 18 million people that are represented here. And the other cities wanted to start doing it too. So after I left the USGS, we went into a partnership with SCAG. We set up a cohort process where we sat and met with the city officials. We ended up with 40 cities joining our cohorts and working with them, and they're setbacks. Some cities ended up dropping, some got hit by the Thomas fire and got delayed pretty significantly in the process. But we really are moving forward. 2 other cities have already joined Los Angeles in mandatory retrofit of bad buildings, West Hollywood and Santa Monica. We have another dozen that are literally in process. Actually, I gather Oakland voted on it last night, so to move out of Southern California. Pasadena's voting on it next month. We've got a lot of cities that are working on it now and moving forward. And a group of others that have also been dealing with other sorts of issues, especially around their non-structural problems or their utilities, and especially on working with their water systems. Okay. So, why is this working? What lessons can we learn about this process to deal with those problems that I laid out at the beginning? I think one important thing is that we focused on a scenario. Again, that it's a story. People need stories. They need to understand. They need help going from the science to the implications. A scenario also avoids probabilities. People don't think in probabilities. When you're talking about probabilities, you are talking about the uncertainties. You're talking about the part that you don't know. Right? By moving away from probabilities, which is I don't know when, to talking about the impacts, I do know what, we made it more actionable. We also, and I think this is potentially the most important thing, was emphasizing consensus. This wasn't about an individual researcher. It was about getting the community together. that peer review is really important internally. But when we take it into this process, I have a friend who calls it the circular firing squad. And we have done this very often to each other. We shoot each other. We attack the work, the details of somebody, and on the outside, the others are just seeing that we don't know yet. We're still attacking. We're still fighting. If you could emphasize consensus, you move away from that, and again, make it more actionable. I think it was also important that we emphasized financial outcomes rather than really focusing on life safety issues. We are tempted in natural hazards to focus on life safety. That's a big part that scares us. But when we're scared, a common reaction to being scared is to say, I'm going to pretend it isn't going to happen. I think that explains a lot of climate change. It's so scary, I'd rather believe it's not true than believe I have to deal with it. And when we think about life safety issues, that's often really dangerous as well. By instead saying, okay, this is going to cost you $250 billion. When do you want to pay it? Do you want to get ready so it doesn't further disrupt our economy, or do you want to deal with it afterwards? And that helped people make it more actionable, because when it's money, you can make decisions. When it's lives, you just get scared. I think another really important point was maintaining this difference between science and policy, even as we work together really closely. Because my job was to make sure the policymakers understood the implications of their decisions. It was not to make their decisions for them. They were the ones that were elected to make these decisions. I wasn't. And so we have this dilemma that we are afraid of stepping over and becoming advocates, so we stay so far away from the line that we don't give you the implications. And what we have to do is find that place where we can get close enough that they really do understand the consequences of their decisions without moving over to trying to tell them what to do. I mean, it may seem obvious when I show with the, if you do this, all of these people are going to die, and if you do this, they won't. I obviously know what I want to see happen, but it's still not my decision to do that. And it was an interesting process being in City Hall and coming to the recognition. In the end, the mayor decided what was in the report. He listened to my advice, but he listened to the advice of his other advisors as well. And I had to accept that. Of course, in this situation, especially since I worked for the USGS and not for the mayor, I could say, that's the mayor's decision. I don't agree with it, but that's his decision. And of course, he knew I had that option, which may be influenced in what he chose to do. And in fact, the report had nothing to which I needed to say that. But the process taught me I had to recognize how far my role went and no farther. The other thing that happened, because I spent the year there, because we really engaged one-on-one, I went through 130 meetings in that 10 months that I was in City Hall. Many of it with the public, sitting down, trying to work it through. And this is really important, because if the answer comes at you from on high, the scientist tells you you need to do this, that triggers your argument why you don't want to listen to it. Instead, what we did is we said, here's the problem. What do you think we should do about it? Let's explore solutions. And by doing it together with me in the room, with other scientists in the room, with other engineers there, we explored the options. And then the solution maybe only had a tiny piece from one person, but that one person could look and see his fingerprints on it. It mostly maybe wasn't what he wanted, but like the Building Owners and Management Association could see how we had listened to them and gave them 30 years instead of 25. To retrofit the buildings. And that sort of thing, they had a role, they were part of it, and that created ownership. And that was what let it happen. We didn't have opponents by the time we got through this difficult, tiring process, but it got it done. And the last thing is just that relationships matter. This didn't happen because I came in at one point. It came because I and other scientists at the USGS especially, but also the other organizations in California, we'd been in there working with people over time. You don't get to just drop in and have this happen. It happened because we'd been working together for years and we're ready to be able to hear things going together. So I think when we get back to this, my bottom line would be we need to support research. We need to find a way to support researchers doing this work that is not in the traditional realm. I have heard that the National Academy is developing guidelines for including policy work in tenure evaluations. That's like the most important thing that I've heard coming as a way to really try and bridge this gap. We need to respect that it needs to be researchers. We need people who really understand the opportunities and the limitations of research, who can make that evaluation of what data is ready to move in the public sphere, which is still being argued. That requires a researcher's viewpoint. But we need to support them as they go in and do this. And in this context, I then want to finish with essentially announcing what I'm going to be doing about it. Caltech has approached me, and we have agreed to create a series of what I'm calling science activation workshops to help students understand what's required in working with policymakers. So we're going to be putting on the first workshop in January, where we will be having classroom discussion of the sort of issues I've just been raising with you and interactive stuff to look about how to bridge some of those problems, and then help them develop messages for policymakers and take them on actual visits, working with elected officials, and then debriefing afterwards. And I'm incredibly excited that Caltech wants to offer this to their students. The other thing that's pretty impressive, I said I could take 20 students. We got 60 applying. And so Caltech's already committed to a second workshop. So you got to remember Caltech's small. 60 students actually represents 5% of their graduate student body applied for this first round. So there's a real demand for this type of work. And I think that we're smart people. As scientists, once we understand what the issues are, we can bridge them. But we need to be we can't just accept the implicit system that we've got that defines what our organization, how we interact with each other. We need to understand what's the difference between that and between what we do internally, what's needed externally, and how do we bridge that difference. And I am excited for our field in the degree to which I see young people wanting to take this step. We are seeing a cultural shift, and I really am encouraged. I realize, part of it is we've watched what's happened with climate change and watching the wholesale rejection of the fundamentals of science. And we realize we can't continue in our academic towers in the way we have been, but we have people that want to be going forward with this, to which I am really grateful, because we really are all in this together. Thank you.
We have time for the questions.
Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. Scientists have written a record and published papers in specialized journals, and we found that record to get in the way of your communication.
So really the question is whether the need to publish gets in the way of doing this. It can, in that there is a perception that the time you spend doing this is not giving you the papers you should be doing. And that's why I think this move by the National Academy to look at how to evaluate this work and give credit for it is incredibly important. But I would also say, when we did the Shakeout Scenario, I was basically saying, okay, I'm backing off from trying to do the publishing. I'm going to be just facilitating this work. Let's get it done. And we had the Shakeout, and we also did a couple of other scenarios, a tsunami and a storm. At the end of the 5 years leading that, I had 40 publications. It was my most productive 5 years ever in my career. Obviously I wasn't first author on all of those, but the process of actually turning science from our theoretical ideas into the practical opened up a whole suite of things where we hadn't quite made the connections. There turned out to be a lot of science that needed to be done to connect the dots. And so you can be innovative in the area, and part of it is a mindset. Part of it is believing that this matters.
So I know that we're speaking mostly in the context of natural hazard courses, but sometimes our communication with elected officials and that is about funding the fundamental science, and it's much easier to justify why we need to worry about our lights and our gas lines. And I wonder if you could speak at all to how we can better communicate for some more fundamental things that may not
So the question, fundamental science versus a much more practical side of it. Well, and it's an interesting thing about the interaction with policymakers. There really are two parts of it. One of it is about cultivating support for science, and the other part is cultivating the use of the science. And both factors are clearly important and involve our elected officials in making those decisions. The thing is, however fundamental is, there's probably some good human goal in the long run. You know, I ended up in an argument, this is a little more practical, just take it within earthquakes. You know, the USGS is supposed to be funding work that's about getting, you know, reducing hazards. And so some people would argue, you know, we need to be funding this work to map exactly the length of the fault so we can tell if it's going to be a 7.2 or a 7.4. And I'm like, really? That's supposed to be making a difference? You know, that actually doesn't get policy. Funding fundamental work about the nature of the earthquake process is a step that's going to happen before we'll ever be able to get prediction or prove prediction impossible. Either one of them allows us to move forward. And so I do tend to try to connect it back to human need, but I don't think we need to get back to, you know, it isn't about setting up, you know, this road. It can be very fundamental, but I think helping people understand why even that very fundamental science improves the human condition writ large. Because if it doesn't, really, should we be funding it? You know, the connection may be really, really long. And we as scientists recognize that you can go from very fundamental, there's a whole suite of fundamental that's needed before you ever get to the rest. But I think helping others see that connection from the very fundamental to the larger is part of that process of support.
Any other? Yes.
Behind you. Then you're second.
Excited when you talk about policy engagement and tenure recognition. So I'm kind of curious about a couple things around that. One is, how can conventional scientific institutions recognize the type of engagement that you're suggesting takes place between the scientific and policy community? And then secondly, are conventional institutions sufficient? Do we need other types of institutions or boundary spanning organizations? You're doing it well too. What are the organizations that are needed? How do we fund them?
Okay. Yes, right, there's the problem. I do think, I mean, this thing from the academy, I'm not quite sure what it's going to be, and I'm like glad that those guys are trying to figure it out. I've never been involved in a tenure, you know, I never worked for a university, so I was never involved in a tenure evaluation. I think there are ways of evaluating it, and we need to find it. You know, a friend of mine talks about the space between academia and the users as a demilitarized zone, which I think is a little high. I'm trying to call it translation space or something, right? But I think there is a fundamental issue that the non-scientists don't know how to get in there because there's too much need for research understanding. So I think it is a matter of we have to figure out how to support people from a research background. PhDs teach you how to evaluate the validity of claims. And that's skills that are needed to be in there and doing that. We've got to figure out a different way of funding it. And I mean, one thing, sometimes I think I just got to wait for a bunch of people to die, because I see a generational shift going on, that there is a much bigger interest in this in a younger generation. And yet those who sort of, we own the academic space and we're sure of what is the appropriate evaluation. And that's where the shift has to happen, is in how we value this space. And you know, I am astonished at how many quite young people I hear still have their advisors telling them, don't do that work, it's not going to get you, you know, I think that professors need to look at what messages they're giving to students and how they value it, and I'm not quite sure how to get that shift to happen, but that's where it is. And then the other piece really is about funding that space. I mean, I'm basically pulling this off because I retired and I have my pension and I can sort of get out there, and I'm still working at how to fund the process. And it isn't at all obvious where you go to fund that work. And you know, the degree, I'm getting some funding from the cities, and because there's a desire for it, but I'd like to be able to expand it where I actually had like fellows that we brought in young scientists and did this and sent them on then to academic work. But I haven't figured out yet how to fund that type of activity. Yes?
I'm a civil engineer.
Hi.
Engineers have to make decisions and help people, and what you've provided is incredibly valuable stuff for engineers. So you can take the word science out of this talk and use engineering and do an incredibly good job. In answer to the question back here, the National Academy of Engineering has a document fairly recently looking at alternative paths for recognizing contributions in academia. They know this is important. Last thing is, I knew Gilbert White personally. He would have been incredibly proud of your talk.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Any other questions? If there is no question, I would like to come.
Okay.
And Lucy Jones, come here. Okay. So here is the Gilbert.
Oh, wow.